"You killed him. Wife stole $800K insurance until I found son's hidden lockbox." Those were the words. Sharon screamed at me, her face a mask of fake grief in front of our friends and family. We were standing in the cold, manicured grass of the cemetery, the smell of dirt still fresh in the air. My son, my only child, Ethan, was gone, and the woman I had loved for 20 years was pointing a finger at me, her voice cutting through the quiet sadness like a shard of glass. I just stood there frozen, the world a blurry mess of black suits and sympathetic looks that now felt like accusations. Sharon screamed, "You killed him," as the $800K insurance money arrived, but I found my son's hidden lockbox. Subscribe, and like to see where this accusation led me. The accident had happened 2 weeks earlier, a supposed brake failure on Ethan's car. He was only 17, a good kid with a bright future. I was the one who taught him how to drive, the one who checked his car every month. The police report called it a tragic mechanical failure, an act of God, but Sharon needed a villain, and she chose me. The insurance policy was for $800,000, a massive sum we had taken out years ago, a safety net for his college, for his future. I never imagined we would be cashing it. I certainly never imagined it would be used as a weapon against me. Sharon had changed after Ethan's death. The change was so fast it was terrifying. Her grief seemed hollow, rehearsed. Our family friend, Richard, was suddenly always there. He was a financial advisor, a smooth talker in expensive suits. He would put his hand on her shoulder, whispering in her ear while I was in the other room, drowning in memories. He was supposed to be helping with the paperwork, the estate, but his eyes lingered on her a little too long. His smile never quite reached them. The insurance check arrived 3 weeks after the funeral. It was made out to Sharon as the primary beneficiary. The day it cleared, I came home from work to find a letter on the kitchen table. It was from a lawyer. She was filing for divorce. The letter cited irreconcilable differences and, in a cruel, calculated line, mentioned my negligence in Ethan's death. She had drained our joint bank accounts and was gone. The house, which was in her name from a previous inheritance, was no longer my home. I was left with nothing. Sharon and Richard stole the $800,000 and my son's memory, leaving me with a false accusation that poisoned my life. But they didn't know about Ethan. They didn't know my son was more observant than they ever gave him credit for. They didn't know he kept secrets. This is the story of how I used my son's last secret to burn their entire world to the ground. My new life was a one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat in a part of town I used to avoid. The air always smelled faintly of soap and damp clothes. My alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., just like always, but now it was for a job at a warehouse, lifting boxes for $12 an hour. The ceiling had a water stain that looked a little like a sad face if you stared at it long enough. Every night I'd sit on my lumpy couch and look at the one picture I had of Ethan, a photo of us at a baseball game, both of us smiling, a moment of pure, simple happiness that now felt like it belonged to another man's life. 6 months passed like a long, gray blur. I was just a ghost, moving through the motions of living. My parents had stored the contents of Ethan's bedroom at their house. They kept asking me to go through it, to decide what to keep. For months I couldn't. The thought of touching his things was like pressing on a raw nerve. But one Saturday I finally drove over. I needed to feel close to him, even if it hurt. His room was exactly as he'd left it. Posters of bands I'd never heard of on the walls, a stack of video games next to his console, a half-finished model car on his desk. The air was still, thick with the scent of him, a mix of old books and laundry he never put away. I sat on his bed, the springs groaning under my weight. I started sorting things into piles. Keep, donate, throw away. It was mechanical, a way to keep the tears from coming. Under his bed, covered in a thin layer of dust, was an old shoebox. I almost tossed it into the throwaway pile, thinking it was just old sneakers, but it felt heavier than it should. I pulled it out and opened the lid. Inside was a collection of teenage memories, ticket stubs from a concert we went to, a dried flower from his first date, a few photos of him and his friends making goofy faces. My heart ached, but beneath it all there was something else, a small, gray metal lockbox. It was the kind you could buy at any office supply store with a simple keyhole. I didn't have a key. I shook it, but it made no sound. I remembered him mentioning his treasure box once or twice. I had smiled and dismissed it, thinking it was where he kept his savings for a new video game. Now, it felt different. It felt important. Tucked into a flap on the side of the shoebox, I found a small black notebook, a diary. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was Ethan's messy, slanted handwriting. The first few pages were what I expected. Complaints about homework, notes about a girl he liked, plans for the summer. I felt a pang of guilt, like I was invading his privacy, but I couldn't stop. I kept turning the pages. Then, I saw an entry from a month before the accident. My blood went cold. He wrote about hearing Mom on the phone late at night. He mentioned her talking to Uncle Richard. He wrote down a few phrases he overheard. Words like, the plan, and after it's done, and we'll finally be free. He wrote that he didn't understand what they were talking about, but that his mom sounded strange. Scared, but also excited. Suddenly, the little metal box in my lap felt like it it weighed 1,000 pounds. It wasn't a box of teenage treasures. It was a box of secrets. His secrets. And with a horrible, chilling certainty, I knew that whatever was inside that box was the key. The key to what really happened to my son. The key to my revenge. I had to open it. I didn't know how, but I knew that Ethan's memory and my future depended on it. And in the last line of that diary entry, he gave me a clue. He wrote, "I put the key where Dad always told me to hide important things, where the old roots run deep, where the old roots run deep." The words from my son's diary bounced around in my head for the rest of the day. I sat on the floor of his old room, the metal lockbox in my lap, turning the phrase over and over. It felt like a line from a poem, something a teenager would write to sound deep. But Ethan wasn't like that. He was direct, literal. If he wrote it, it meant something real. My mind raced through all the places we had shared. Our favorite fishing spot, the park where I taught him to ride a bike. Nothing felt right. Those places were about us, but the phrase felt older, bigger, old roots. It had to be something with history. Then it hit me, a memory so clear it was like watching a movie. We were at my parents' house about 5 years ago. Ethan was 12. We were sitting in the backyard under the giant oak tree, the one my grandfather had planted almost 100 years ago. Its roots were like thick, gnarled veins breaking through the surface of the grass. Ethan had just gotten a new pocket knife and was trying to hide it from his cousins. I remember smiling and telling him, "If you ever need to hide something really important, a real secret, you don't put it in a drawer. You put it somewhere safe, where the old roots run deep." It was just a father-son moment, a random piece of advice I'd probably forgotten 5 minutes later, but he hadn't. My boy had remembered. When I pulled the key from the dirt under the old oak tree, I thought I had found the answer to everything. I'd found a loose stone at the base of the trunk just like the one I had shown him, and my fingers had closed around the cold, small piece of metal buried in the soil. But it wasn't just a key. Tied to it with a thin piece of string was a tiny folded piece of paper, sealed in a small plastic bag to protect it from the damp earth. On it, in Ethan's handwriting, were 2 words, "the brakes." My breath caught in my throat, but I still didn't know what those words really meant. Was it a note to himself? A warning he never got to act on? And what exactly would this key unlock? I didn't say goodbye to my parents. I just got in my car and drove, the key clutched in my fist. The lockbox was back at my apartment waiting. The drive felt like an eternity. Every red light was a personal insult. Every slow car in front of me was an obstacle to the truth. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely keep them on the steering wheel. The brakes. The police report said brake failure. A tragic accident. But Sharon and Richard had a plan. I burst into my apartment, slamming the door behind me. The box was on my coffee table, a silent gray rectangle. I sat on the floor in front of it, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I carefully untied the note from the key and set it aside. My fingers fumbled as I pushed the key into the lock. It was a cheap lock, but it felt like I was opening a bank vault. There was a small click, a sound that seemed to echo in the tiny room. I lifted the lid. At first, I was confused. There were no documents, no stack of cash. Instead, there was a single USB flash drive, the kind you could buy anywhere. Next to it was a small, cheap audio recorder, the type a student might use for lectures. It looked out of place, almost like a toy. Was this it? Was this Ethan's big secret? A flash drive and a recorder? My hope began to sink. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was all just a teenager's fantasy, a game he was playing. I picked up the audio recorder first. It was small and black, light in my hand. There was a small play button on the side. With a sense of dread, I pressed it. For a second, there was only static. Then, a voice filled the room. It was Sharon. Her voice was low, conspiratorial, not the warm tone she used with me, but something cold and sharp. "It has to look like an accident, Richard," she was saying. "No questions. The brakes are the easiest way. Nobody ever questions the brakes on a teenager's car." Then I heard his voice, smooth and confident. "Don't worry, I have a guy. He owes me a favor. He'll be quiet and he's good. He'll loosen the line just enough. It won't fail right away. It'll happen when he's going fast. On the highway, it will be a tragedy. Everyone will feel so sorry for the grieving mother." A wave of nausea washed over me. I dropped the recorder as if it were on fire. It clattered onto the floor, Sharon's voice still spilling out, a venomous whisper from beyond the grave of my old life. "And the insurance money? The full 800,000? She asked. "All yours," Richard replied. "Ours. We'll be free. A new life, just like we planned." I couldn't breathe. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. My son hadn't died in an accident. He was murdered. Murdered by his own mother and the man I called a friend. And my clever, observant boy had suspected something. He had recorded them. He had left me the proof. I looked at the flash drive still sitting in the box. The audio was damning. What could possibly be on that drive that was even worse? My world tilted on its axis. The floor felt like it was falling away beneath me, and the only thing holding me in place was the sound of my own ragged breathing. My son, my Ethan. They hadn't just let him die. They had pushed him over the edge. They had planned it, discussed it like they were choosing a restaurant for dinner. The image of Sharon at the funeral, crying into a handkerchief, flashed in my mind. It wasn't grief. It was a performance. And I, like everyone else, had been her captive audience. Rage, cold and pure, started to replace the shock. It was a feeling so intense it was almost calming. It burned away the tears, the despair, the 6 months of empty fog I had been living in. In its place was a singular, sharp purpose. They had taken my son. They had taken my life. I was going to take everything from them. My father used to say that patience wasn't about waiting, but about knowing the right moment to act. My moment was coming. I picked up the audio recorder, its plastic shell now feeling sinister, and placed it carefully back in the lockbox. My eyes fell on the flash drive. It was a cheap, generic blue plastic thing, the kind you get for free at a conference. Yet, it held the other half of my son's final message. My hands were steady now. The trembling had stopped. I walked over to the second-hand laptop I'd bought for job hunting, its fan whirring loudly in the quiet room. I plugged the drive into the USB port. An icon popped up on the screen. Ethan's evidence. My boy. He knew. He didn't just suspect. He knew he was building a case. I clicked it open. The folder wasn't filled with pictures or school projects. It contained 3 things: a folder of screen captures, a document named Money Trail, and a single video file. I opened the screen captures first. They were emails, dozens of them exchanged between Sharon's personal account and an account under a fake name that was clearly Richard. Ethan must have found her password or used a keylogger. The emails were a timeline of their betrayal. They started over a year before Ethan's death. Flirtatious messages turned into plans for secret meetings. Then they started talking about me, about how I was holding Sharon back, how my boring, simple life was a prison for her. Then came the insurance policy. They talked about the $800,000 figure, like a prize to be won. Richard had been the one to suggest increasing the coverage, calling it a smart investment in Ethan's future. Reading his words now made my stomach churn. He wasn't investing in Ethan's future. He was setting his price. Next, I opened the Money Trail document. Ethan, always so good with computers, had tracked Richard's finances. He had found records of Richard's failing investment firm, the deep debt he was in, the angry clients threatening to sue. He wasn't the successful advisor he pretended to be. He was a desperate man on the verge of ruin. The $800,000 wasn't just for a new life with Sharon. It was his lifeline. I saved the most difficult for last, the video file. I clicked play. The screen was dark at first. Then a shaky image appeared. It was filmed from inside a car looking at the dashboard. It was Ethan's car. My son's voice, young and a little nervous, came from behind the camera, which was likely his phone. "I'm just making this, just in case," he said, his voice quiet. "Mom and Richard are acting weird, and the brakes feel funny. They're soft. Dad checked them last month. They were fine." He pushed on the brake pedal. I could see his foot in the frame. The pedal went down too far with a soft, squishing sound. "See?" he said. "Something's wrong." The video ended. It was dated the morning of the accident. He knew. My son knew something was wrong, and he was trying to leave a warning. He was scared, and I wasn't there to protect him. I closed the laptop. The evidence was overwhelming. The audio, the emails, the financial records, the video. I had everything. I could go to the police right now and they would be arrested by nightfall. But that felt too easy, too quick. Prison was a punishment, yes, but it wasn't enough. They had destroyed my world slowly, methodically. They had made me suffer. I wanted them to feel a fraction of that. I wanted to dismantle the life they had built on my son's grave, brick by stolen brick. They saw me as a simple, broken man, a warehouse worker living in a cheap apartment. They would never see me coming. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't a cop. I needed someone who thought like they did, someone who operated in the gray areas. I pulled out my phone and typed "best private investigator in the city" into the search bar. A name popped up, highly recommended, with reviews that spoke of his discretion and relentless methods. His name was Frank. The website said he was an ex-cop who specialized in financial crimes and infidelity. A perfect combination. My finger hovered over the call button. This was it. The first move in a game they didn't even know they were playing. I pressed the button and held the phone to my ear, the sound of it ringing a promise of the storm to come. The phone call with Frank was short and to the point. He gave me an address in a part of the city where the buildings seemed to sag with exhaustion. There were no pleasantries. His voice was like gravel being poured onto concrete, and he simply said, "Be here in an hour. Bring everything." I put the lockbox into a worn-out backpack, the weight of it a solid, cold thing against my spine. The drive there was a blur of cracked pavement and faded storefronts. I was in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the one Ethan used to call the reliable rust bucket. The steering wheel was smooth and worn under my palms from years of use. I passed by luxury car dealerships and expensive restaurants, places Sharon and I used to go. They looked like scenes from a foreign film now, a life that belonged to someone else. The rage in my chest wasn't hot anymore. It had cooled into something heavy and dense, like a block of ice. Frank's office was on the second floor of a brick building, above a bail bondsman and a palm reader. The stairs creaked with every step, and the hallway smelled of dust and disappointment. His door just had a name on it, Frank Martin, in peeling gold letters. I knocked. The man who opened the door looked like he was carved from a block of granite. He was big, with a bald head and eyes that seemed to have seen everything twice. He wore a cheap suit that was clean but rumpled like he'd slept in it. He didn't smile. He just grunted and gestured for me to come in. The office was small and cluttered. A metal desk was covered in messy files, a half-empty coffee mug, and an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. The blinds on the window were bent, casting striped shadows across the room. On the wall there was a framed certificate from the police academy dated 30 years ago. "Sit," he said, pointing to a worn leather chair that looked like it might collapse. He sat behind his desk, the chair groaning in protest. "You have 1 hour. Talk." I didn't waste time. I took out the lockbox and placed it on his desk. I explained everything, from Ethan's death to the funeral, Sharon's accusations, and finding the diary. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was just a report of the facts. He listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving my face. Then, I opened the box. I took out the audio recorder and pressed play. Sharon's and Richard's voices filled the small, dusty office. Their casual discussion of my son's murder was obscene in the quiet room. Frank's expression didn't change, but I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. When it was over, he just nodded slowly. "And this?" he asked, pointing to the flash drive. I plugged it into his old humming desktop computer. I showed him the emails, the money trail, the final heartbreaking video from Ethan's phone. He scrolled through it all, his movements slow and deliberate. The only sound was the clicking of his mouse and the hum of the old computer. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair, the springs screaming. He stared at the screen for a long moment. I thought I had a clear path, a simple solution. I'd hand this all over to the police and they'd do the rest. But when Frank finally turned to look at me, his face wasn't filled with shock or pity. It was a mask of cold professional assessment. His eyes were like chips of ice. "So you want to go to the cops," he said. It wasn't a question. "I want them to pay," I replied. He let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded like a cough. "The cops will get you justice," he said, his voice low. Trial lawyers, maybe they plead down to manslaughter. Richard will blame Sharon, she'll blame him. With good lawyers, they could be out in 15 years, maybe less. That's justice. It's not revenge." The word hung in the air between us. Revenge. It was exactly what I wanted, but I hadn't dared to say it out loud. What did he mean? What other way was there? "They took everything from you," Frank continued, leaning forward, his big hands flat on the desk. "They took your son, your money, your name. They left you with nothing and laughed while they did it. You want to hand them over to a system that will give them a clean bed and 3 meals a day?" He shook his head. "That's not how this works. Not if you want them to feel what you felt." He explained that the evidence was perfect, too perfect almost, but it was the key to unlocking their world, not just their jail cells. He told me that before we went to the police, we would dismantle their lives. We would take their money, their reputation, their friends. We would leave them as broken and alone as they had left me. We would make them watch their perfect new life burn to the ground, and only when they were sitting in the ashes with nothing left would we hand them over to the law. "We have the proof of the murder," Frank said, tapping the flash drive with a thick finger. "That's our endgame, our checkmate. But a good chess player doesn't go straight for the king. He takes all the other pieces off the board first." I looked at this stranger, this tired, cynical man in a dusty office, and for the first time in 6 months, I felt a flicker of something other than pain or rage. It was hope, a dark, terrible kind of hope. "What's the first move?" I asked. My voice was steady. Frank smiled for the first time. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the grin of a predator. "The first move," he said, "is finding Richard's guy, the mechanic who owes him a favor. We're going to make him our guy." Finding the mechanic was easier than I expected. Frank didn't use computers or phones. He used a network of old-timers. Guys who knew things because they'd been around forever. 2 calls from a payphone and a $20 bill slipped to a bartender got us a name and an address. The mechanic's name was Dale, and his shop and Dale's Auto Repair was a greasy 2-bay garage tucked behind a laundromat on the industrial side of town. We drove there in Frank's car, a beat-up 1990s Ford sedan that smelled like old coffee and stale cigarette smoke. The vinyl seats were cracked, and the engine made a low grumble that seemed to match Frank's personality. As we sat across the street, watching the garage, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. This was it, the first real step down a path I couldn't turn back from. "He's a family man," Frank said, pointing his chin towards a faded photograph taped to the inside of the garage's grimy office window. "Wife, 2 kids, nice little house in the suburbs. He's got a lot to lose." He said it so casually, like he was reading a grocery list. We waited until closing time, just after 6 p.m. Dale was locking up, a tired-looking man in his late 40s with oil stains on his face and hands that looked permanently dirty. Frank got out of the car, and I followed. We didn't rush him. We just stood there letting him see us. His eyes widened a little when he noticed us. He clutched his keys tighter. "We're closed," he said, his voice wary. "We're not here for a tune-up," Frank said, his voice calm and low. He took a step closer. "We're here to talk about Richard." The color drained from Dale's face. He tried to look tough, puffing out his chest. "Don't know any Richard?" He lied, and it was a terrible lie. Frank smiled that cold, predator's grin again. "Sure you do. He's the guy who paid you $5,000 in cash to mess with the brake line on a teenager's car. A kid named Ethan." Dale started to sweat. He looked from Frank to me, and I just stared back, letting him see all the pain and anger in my eyes. I didn't have to say a word. My face said it all. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dale stammered, backing away towards the door of his shop. Frank held up a hand. "Stop. We're not cops. If we were, you'd already be in handcuffs. We're something else." He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket. It wasn't the flash drive. It was cash. "That $5,000 Richard gave you, it's a lot for a guy like you, but it's not go to prison for murder money, is it?" Dale swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the envelope. "Richard is going down," Frank continued, his voice like gravel, "and when he does, he's going to drag everyone down with him. He'll tell the cops you did it all, that he just asked for a simple repair and you're the one who made the mistake. Who do you think they'll believe? The rich investment banker or the greasy mechanic with a gambling problem?" Dale flinched. Frank knew about that too. Of course he did. How did you know?" Dale whispered. "Richard talks," Frank said simply. "He brags, especially when he thinks he's won. He told a friend you owed him from some bad bets, and this was how you paid him back. He thinks you're his pawn." Frank stepped closer and put the envelope on a rusty oil drum between them. "We're offering you a way out. You're going to become our pawn instead." Dale looked at the envelope, then at me. His tough act was gone, replaced by pure fear. "What do you want me to do?" "Everything Richard tells you to do from now on. You clear it with us first," Frank explained. "You're going to wear a wire. You're going to record every conversation. You are going to be the loose thread that unravels his entire world." Frank pushed the envelope towards him. "This is $10,000, a down payment. You do what we say, and there's another $40,000 waiting for you when this is over. And you walk away. No prison, no charges. You just disappear." The offer hung in the oily air. Freedom and $50,000, or prison for life. It wasn't much of a choice. Dale reached out with a trembling, dirty hand and took the envelope. He didn't count it. He just held it like it was both a lifeline and a bomb. "Good choice," Frank said. He turned and walked back to the car. I stayed for a moment longer, looking at Dale. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the ground, a broken man. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything except a cold, hard satisfaction. One piece was off the board. Now it was time for the next one. The drive back from the garage was silent for the first 10 minutes. The smell of oil and fear seemed to cling to my clothes. Frank drove his boring gray sedan with a steady, calm focus that was almost unnerving. He wasn't my friend doing a favor. He was an expert at work. "He'll do it," Frank finally said, not taking his eyes off the road. "Fear is a better motivator than loyalty, especially for a guy like Dale." "And the money," I added, my voice sounding hollow in the car. "And the money," Frank agreed. "He's a simple problem with a simple solution. Richard thinks he's a master manipulator, but he's just an arrogant amateur. He picked a weak pawn, and weak pawns can be turned." He pulled up a block away from my house and put the car in park. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small hardshell case, the kind you'd use for expensive sunglasses. He opened it. Inside, nestled in foam, were two tiny black dots, no bigger than the head of a pin, and a thin, flexible wire. "This is the microphone," he said, pointing to one of the dots. "It's military grade, can pick up a whisper from 20 feet away. The other is a tracker. Dale will have this sewn into the collar of his work shirt. We'll hear everything, and we'll know where he is at all times. My team will be listening to the live feed." My team. The words hung there. I realized I had no idea who Frank really was, or who he worked for. I only knew he was a security consultant introduced by a lawyer years ago. He was a ghost who knew how to make other ghosts. "What do I do now?" I asked. "You wait," he said, closing the case. "You go home. You act normal. You mourn your son. Richard needs to believe you're a broken man, not a threat. The moment he contacts Dale, we move. Dale will call a number I gave him and we'll handle the rest." I got out of the car and walked back to the empty house. The silence inside was a physical thing, a weight on my chest. I walked past my bedroom, past the closed door to Sharon's guest room, and went straight to Ethan's room. I hadn't been inside since the day of the funeral. His bed was still unmade, a history textbook open on his desk to a chapter he'd never finish. I sat on the edge of his bed, the springs creaking under my weight. I picked up a baseball from his nightstand, the leather worn smooth from years of use. The whole plan, the wires, the money, Dale, it all felt dirty. It felt like something that belonged in a dark alley, not in the home I'd built for my son. But then I pictured Sharon's face at the funeral, her fake tears. I pictured Richard's smug smile. The cold, hard feeling returned, pushing the guilt away. A week went by. It was the longest week of my life. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. I drove past Richard's office once, a glass tower downtown. I saw him through the window laughing on the phone, looking like he owned the world. Another evening, I followed them. Sharon and Richard. They went to a fancy Italian restaurant, the kind with white tablecloths and wine that cost $200 a bottle. I watched from my car across the street as they toasted, their faces close together, smiling. My wife, grieving our son with the man who helped kill him. The sight burned away any last bit of hesitation I had. My grief was turning into something else, something sharper and much more useful. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the call came. It was an unknown number. I answered. He called me, a shaky voice whispered. It was Dale. He wants to meet tonight at the old shipping yard by the docks. My hand tightened on the phone. Did you call Frank's number? Yeah, I did. They told me what to do. They're gonna put the thing on me in an hour. He sounded like he was about to be sick. He said he has my final payment. He said it's for a job well done. A job well done. The words made my blood run cold. He was going to pay Dale for murdering my son. Finally, I had him. I had the proof, the weapon, the one loose thread that would unravel everything. Richard and Sharon had no idea what was coming for them. They were sitting in their high-end world, laughing and drinking expensive wine, thinking they had gotten away with it. In a few hours, their perfect world would start to burn to the ground. But first, I needed that recording. I needed to hear the words from his own mouth. I drove to a location Frank had given me, a forgotten corner of the industrial district about half a mile from the shipping yard. It was a dead-end street with a view of the rusted chain-link fence that surrounded the docks. A dark blue, windowless Ford van was already parked there, looking like it had been abandoned years ago. I pulled up behind it and killed my headlights. The rain was starting to come down harder, tapping a nervous rhythm on the roof of my car. A moment later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. We are in the van. Connect to the audio feed link we sent you. Do not exit your vehicle. Do not approach the yard. It was cold, professional, exactly like Frank. I opened the link. A crackle of static filled my car. Then the sound of Dale's ragged breathing and the drumming of rain on what sounded like thin metal. He must have been hiding under an awning. I could hear his teeth chattering. I leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes, and just listened. Every second felt like an hour. My own breathing felt too loud. A clumsy intrusion on the professional silence of the operation. I thought about Ethan, about teaching him to change a tire in this very car. He'd gotten grease on his cheek and laughed when I pointed it out. The memory was a sharp, painful thing, a knife twisting in my gut. This was for him. All of this was for him. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel through my phone's speaker. A car door opened and slammed shut. You're late. Dale's voice was a high-pitched squeak. Then, I heard Richard's voice, smooth and condescending even through the static. Relax, Dale. You're getting paid, aren't you? A little patience. I sat up straight, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. That voice, the same voice that had offered me condolences at the funeral, his hand on my shoulder. I just want my money, Dale said. I did what you asked. I don't want any part of this anymore. She pointed fingers and blamed me for Ethan's death, but Richard was always whispering in her ear. What would you do in my place? Comment and share your thoughts. Of course you don't, Richard chuckled. It was a low, ugly sound. Nobody does. That's the point of paying people like you. You do the dirty work and disappear. I heard the sound of an envelope being passed over. It's all there. $50,000. The final payment for a job well done. My blood ran cold. Those were the exact words Dale had used on the phone. A job well done. The kid's car. It was clean? Dale asked, his voice trembling. They didn't find anything. A tragic mechanical failure, Richard said, mocking the police report. Perfectly executed. You were worth every penny. You cut that brake line so clean it just looked like wear and tear. A freak accident. Nobody suspects a thing. I squeezed my eyes shut. Brake line. He said it. He said the words. The confession was clear, undeniable. I felt a wave of sickness wash over me, followed by a cold, clear rage that burned away everything else. And her? Dale asked. The wife? Sharon is playing her part beautifully, Richard said, his voice dripping with arrogance. The grieving widow. She has everyone fooled, especially her idiot husband. He's so broken he can barely function. Once the full $800,000 from the insurance clears, she and I are gone. A new life, far away from this miserable place. He laughed again. He even thinks I'm helping him with the estate. The poor fool has no idea I'm taking everything he has left. I opened my eyes. The rain was streaking down the windshield, blurring the lights of the distant city into a watery mess. But in my mind, everything was perfectly clear. I had it. I had his voice, his confession, his contempt, his entire disgusting plan laid bare. We're done here, Richard said. Get lost, Dale. If I ever see or hear from you again, You'll end up just like the boy, understand? Yeah, Dale whispered. I understand. I heard footsteps moving away, another car door slamming, and the sound of an engine starting. Through the speaker, I heard Dale let out a long, shaky breath that sounded like a sob. A few seconds later, a sleek, black Mercedes-Benz pulled out of the shipping yard gate and drove past the end of my street, its headlights cutting through the dark. Richard drove calmly, probably listening to some classical music on his way back to my wife. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Frank's team. We have the recording. We are extracting the asset now. Go home. We will be in touch tomorrow with the final package. I turned off the audio feed, plunging my car back into silence except for the rain. It was over. The waiting, the hoping, the uncertainty. It was all gone, replaced by a terrible, heavy certainty. I had the weapon. I had the proof that would burn their world to the ground. They thought I was a broken man, a fool drowning in grief. They had no idea that grief had forged me into something else entirely. I started the car, the engine a low growl in the quiet night. I had his voice. I had his confession, and now I was coming for his soul. I drove home on autopilot, the car's wipers pushing away the rain in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Each swipe was like a metronome counting down the seconds of Sharon and Richard's stolen time. The recording was a burning weight in my pocket, a digital ghost that had just condemned two people. I pulled into the driveway of the house that was no longer a home. It was a stage, a crime scene. I walked in quietly, shaking the rain from my coat. The lights were dim. Sharon was on the sofa, a glass of red wine in her hand, watching some mindless reality show on the television. She looked up as I entered, and her face arranged itself into a familiar mask of concerned sympathy. "You're so late," she said, her voice soft and caring. It was the same voice she used when our friends came over to offer condolences. I was starting to worry. "Are you okay?" I just nodded, unable to trust my own voice. Okay? I was a walking container of pure, distilled hatred. I was a bomb with a lit fuse, and I had to stand here and pretend I was just a sad, empty shell. I just needed some air, I managed to say. She smiled sadly. "I understand. This house, it feels so empty without him." She took a sip of her wine. "You know, Richard called earlier. He's making real progress with the insurance claim. He said the full payment should be processed within the week. He's been such a rock for us." The casual way she said his name, the praise she gave him, it was like a knife twisting in my gut. A rock. He was the rock that had crushed my son. I wanted to lunge across the room. I wanted to play the recording on the television speakers and watch her perfect mask shatter into a million pieces. But my father always told me something. Patience isn't about waiting. It's about knowing the right moment to act. This was not the moment. "That's good," I said, my voice flat. "I'm tired. I'm going to bed." I walked past her, up the stairs, my feet heavy on each step. I didn't go to our bedroom. I couldn't. Instead, I pushed open the door to Ethan's room. It was just as he'd left it. His sneakers were by the door. His guitar was leaning against the wall. A history textbook was open on his desk. The air was thick with his absence. I sat on the edge of his bed, the silence of the room screaming louder than any sound. My eyes drifted to his bookshelf. It was filled with fantasy novels and science textbooks. But one book, an old leather-bound copy of a classic, was sticking out just a tiny bit. I'd seen it 100 times and never thought anything of it. But tonight, everything felt different. I stood up and pulled it from the shelf. It was lighter than it should have been. The center was hollowed out. And inside, nestled in the carved-out pages, was a small metal lockbox. I'd never seen it before. My heart started pounding. Ethan was a private kid, but he wasn't secretive. What could he have needed to hide? I took the box and looked around his room, searching for a key. I checked his desk drawers, his closet, under his pillow. Nothing. Then I saw it. Hanging from a thumbtack on his corkboard, hidden behind a concert ticket, was a tiny, silver key. My hands were trembling as I unlocked the box. I lifted the lid, not knowing what to expect. Inside, there wasn't money or anything illegal. There was just a small, folded piece of paper and a single photograph. The photo was of Sharon and Richard. They were at a restaurant sitting close together laughing. Richard's hand was on her arm. It wasn't a friendly touch. It was possessive, intimate. On the back, in Ethan's handwriting, was a date from 3 months ago. Then I unfolded the paper. It was a printout of a text message exchange. I didn't know who it was with, but Ethan's texts were clear. I saw them again. "Mom and Richard," he had written. "It's not right. He looks at her, and she looks at him. Dad doesn't see it." The response was from a friend. "Dude, you're overthinking it. They're just friends." Ethan's last message sent a chill down my spine. "No, it's more than that. He was talking about Mom's money, about Dad's insurance. I heard him on the phone. He said, 'Soon it'll all be ours.' I don't trust him. He knew. My son knew something was wrong. He was worried. He was trying to figure it out. They didn't just kill him for the money. They killed him because he was a witness. He was a threat to their plan. This lockbox wasn't just a secret. It was his testimony." I closed the box, holding it tight in my hands. The grief I felt was now mixed with a terrible pride. My smart, observant boy. He saw the snakes in his own house. Sharon and Richard had had taken everything from me, but they didn't know about this. They didn't know about the recording, and they didn't know that my son had left me one last gift from beyond the grave, proof of their motive, written in his own words. They thought I was a fool, a broken man. They had no idea. I wasn't broken anymore. I was being rebuilt, piece by piece, into the instrument of their destruction. My hands were cold, but I wasn't shaking anymore. The fire of grief had burned down to hard, sharp embers of purpose. I sat in Ethan's room until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, casting long shadows across his posters. The lockbox felt heavy in my lap, a final terrible inheritance from my son. The picture of Sharon and Richard, their smiling faces a cruel joke, and the printed texts were not enough. A good lawyer, one paid for with my son's blood money, would call it the fantasy of a jealous teenager. The police had already closed the case. I needed more. I needed something they couldn't talk their way out of. I needed a professional, someone who lived in the shadows they thought they owned. I spent the next 2 days digging online, looking for the right kind of person. Not a flashy agency with a downtown office, but someone quiet, someone who understood that some problems required solutions outside the lines. I found a name, Walter, an ex-cop, retired for 20 years with a reputation for being thorough and discreet. His office was a small room above a laundromat, smelling faintly of bleach and regret. Walter was in his late 60s, with a face like a roadmap of bad decisions and a cheap suit that had seen better decades. He didn't say much. He just listened, his eyes never leaving mine as I laid out the story. I didn't show him the contents of the lockbox at first. I just told him about the accident, about Sharon and Richard, about the $800,000 insurance payout. "What do you want from me?" Walter asked, his voice raspy like gravel rolling downhill. "I want you to find the dirt," I said. "I want you to follow Richard. I want to know every dollar he spends, every person he talks to, and I want you to find out who serviced Ethan's car before the crash. I want to know their name, where they live, and if they suddenly came into a lot of money." I pushed a thick envelope across his worn-out wooden desk. It contained $20,000 in cash, a down payment from my own savings. Walter didn't even look inside. He just slid it into his drawer. "It'll cost you more," he said. "I know," I replied. "There's more where that came from." For 3 weeks, I lived in a fog. I went to work. I came home. I ate tasteless food and slept in the guest room. Sharon and I were like ghosts haunting the same house, moving through walls of silence. She was busy with Richard, planning how to invest her newfound wealth. They went to fancy dinners at places like Le Bernardin. I saw the receipts she carelessly left on the kitchen counter. They were planning a trip to Europe. They were celebrating. My silence, my apparent breakdown, was the perfect cover. They saw a broken man, not a man building a cage. Then, one rainy Tuesday night, Walter called. "I got something," he said, no preamble. "The mechanic, his name is Dale, worked at the shop that did the last oil change on your son's car. He quit 2 days after the accident, told his boss he was moving to Florida to take care of his sick mother." My heart hammered against my ribs. "And is he?" Walter chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "His mother died 5 years ago, and he's not in Florida. He's living in a new 2-bedroom apartment about an hour from here. Paid 6 months rent up front, in cash. He also bought a brand new Ford Mustang, in cash." I closed my eyes. This was it, the loose thread. "How much cash are we talking about?" "All told, looks like he spent close to 50 grand in the last month," Walter said. "Funny thing, I got a friend who owes me a favor at the bank. Richard made a cash withdrawal from his business account 3 days before your son's accident. $50,000 on the dot. The pieces didn't just fit, they locked into place with a deafening click. Richard got the money. Dale, the mechanic, got the money. My son got a faulty brake line. It was so simple, so brutal." "Can you get to him, to Dale?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Already did," Walter said. "We had a little chat. He's a coward, folded like a cheap suit. Seems Richard told him it was just an insurance scam, that the kid would get a little banged up and they'd all make some money. He didn't know the boy would die. He's terrified. He wrote it all down. Who, when, how, signed it and everything." I felt a wave of dizziness. A signed confession. It was more than I could have hoped for. "He's a flight risk," Walter continued. "He knows he's in deep. I advised him to stay put. Told him running would only make it worse. He's scared enough to listen for now." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slick street. The world looked the same, but it was entirely different now. I had the truth in my hands. Not just a suspicion, but a chain of evidence, forged in cash and sealed with a coward's confession. Sharon and Richard were laughing in their new life built on the wreckage of mine. They thought the storm had passed. They had no idea the hurricane was just now making landfall, and its name was a grieving father. I held the signed confession in my hands. It was just 3 sheets of cheap lined paper, the kind you buy at a drugstore, but the weight of it felt immense, heavier than any stone. Dale's handwriting was shaky, the blue ink smudged in a few places, maybe from sweat on his palms. I sat in Ethan's room on the edge of his bed. It was the first time I had been in here since the funeral. Everything was exactly as he left it. A physics textbook open on his desk, a half-finished model airplane, the faint smell of his cologne still hanging in the air. My son was in these walls, in these objects, and Sharon and Richard had turned his memory into a price tag. Walter, had advised me to go straight to the police. You have a signed confession, a clear money trail. It's a slam dunk, he had said over the phone. His voice was practical, logical, but his logic didn't account for the fire burning in my chest. Prison wasn't enough. It was too clean, too simple. They would disappear behind bars and the world would forget. I wanted them to fall where everyone could see. I wanted them to lose everything they valued, just like they had made me lose everything I valued. Their money, their reputation, their perfect curated lives. My father used to have a saying. He was a simple man, a carpenter. He always said, patience isn't about waiting. It's about knowing the right moment to swing the hammer. For weeks I had been waiting. Now I finally had the hammer. The plan started with Richard. He was a man built on a foundation of trust, a financial advisor whose entire career depended on his clients believing he was a safe pair of hands. His business, Sterling Wealth Management, was his pride and joy. His name was on the letterhead, on the frosted glass of his downtown office on the 12th floor. He loved to talk about ethics, about fiduciary duty. It was all a performance. I spent 2 days doing nothing but research. I compiled a list of Richard's top 10 clients. These weren't just random people. They were the pillars of his business. A retired surgeon, a tech startup founder, an old money family that had been with his firm for a decade. Then I found the names of his 2 business partners, Kenneth and Martin. They were minority stakeholders, but their names were on the company charter. I went to a 24-hour copy shop at 3 in the morning. The place smelled of burnt coffee and toner. I made 15 copies of Dale's confession. I also made copies of the bank statement showing Richard's $50,000 cash withdrawal. I put each set into a plain manila envelope. No return address. I would mail them all from different post offices across the city. They would arrive on the same day. A coordinated strike. The second part of the plan was for Sharon. Her currency was sympathy. She had played the part of the grieving widow so perfectly. She had even organized a charity fundraiser in Ethan's name. It was for a teen driving safety program. The irony was so thick it made me want to be sick. The event was in 3 days, at the Oak Ridge Country Club, a place where people paid thousands for a membership just to be seen. Richard's company was the main sponsor. A picture of them, smiling sadly, was on the event's website. Sharon was scheduled to give a speech. That would be my stage. I didn't sleep for the next 72 hours. I moved like a machine, fueled by coffee and a cold, clear purpose. I mailed the envelopes on a Thursday morning, timing it so they would arrive on Friday, the day of the charity event. While business partners and clients were reading about Richard's dirty little secret, he and Sharon would be at the country club, basking in fake goodwill. On the night of the event, I put on my best suit. It was the same one I wore to my wedding, the same one I wore to my son's funeral. It felt strange, like a costume from another life. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was thinner. My eyes had dark circles underneath them, but there was a light in them that hadn't been there for months. It wasn't happiness. It was resolve. I drove to the Oak Ridge Country Club. Valets in red jackets were parking a line of expensive cars. A mix of Porsches and high-end Teslas. The sound of soft music and polite laughter drifted from the main ballroom. I walked past the front entrance, around the side of the building, to a service door I knew would be unlocked. I slipped inside, into a hallway that smelled of bleach and kitchen grease. I found a small utility closet and waited. Through the crack in the door, I could hear the master of ceremonies introducing Sharon. His voice was smooth and professional, a woman of incredible strength and grace. Please welcome, Sharon. There was a wave of applause. I took a deep breath. I had a small, powerful audio projector in my coat pocket, the size of a deck of cards. On it was a single audio file. It was a recording of a phone call I had made to Dale the day before. I had told him the police were closing in, that Richard was going to pin everything on him. He panicked. He told me everything again, but this time it was recorded. His terrified voice naming Richard, naming Sharon, describing how they told him it was just a scam. The applause died down. Sharon's voice, trembling with practiced emotion, filled the ballroom. Thank you all for being here to honor my son, Ethan. I pushed the closet door open. It was time to swing the hammer. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and into the grand ballroom. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light on the 200 guests in their expensive tuxedos and evening gowns. No one noticed me at first. All eyes were on Sharon, standing on the stage, a single spotlight making her look like a tragic angel. Her voice was a soft, sad melody. He was the light of my life, she said, her hand going to her chest. And not a day goes by that I don't think about what we lost. I raised the small audio projector, my hand steady. I aimed it at the large white screen behind her, which was currently showing a picture of Ethan smiling. I pressed the button. A new sound filled the room. It was scratchy, panicked. It was Dale's voice, amplified and echoing off the high ceilings. I swear I didn't know, Dale's recorded voice screamed. They told me it was just to scare him. Richard said it was a foolproof way to teach him a lesson about speeding. A collective gasp went through the crowd. People turned in their seats, looking around for the source of the sound. Sharon froze on stage, her mouth half open. Her eyes found me standing at the back of the room. The mask of grief shattered, replaced by pure, cold panic. Richard, who was sitting at the head table, jumped to his feet. His face was the color of chalk. "What is this? Turn that off. Security." But Dale's voice kept going. A ghost in the machine. "He gave me $50,000 in cash. Richard did. He said Sharon wanted it done. She said Ethan was becoming reckless, that the insurance money could give them a fresh start. A fresh start. They told me to mess with the brake line just enough so it would fail at low speed, just to scare him. They promised me nothing bad would happen." The room erupted. It wasn't just murmuring anymore. It was a roar of confusion and anger. People were standing up, pointing at the stage. A woman in a red dress screamed. The clatter of a dropped champagne flute echoed from a nearby table. Sharon grabbed the microphone stand like it was a lifeline. "Lies! These are all lies! He's trying to ruin Ethan's memory!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. Richard was trying to push through the crowd, his eyes wild. "It's a doctored recording, a fake. This man is insane," he yelled, pointing at me. I didn't move. I just stood there, holding the projector, letting Dale's terrified confession do its work. I saw Kenneth and Martin, Richard's business partners, near the front. Their faces were pale with horror. I knew they had received my envelopes that morning. They were looking at Richard not with confusion, but with the cold fury of betrayal. One of them was already on his phone, his thumb moving quickly across the screen. The master of ceremonies, a man named Walter, who ran a local news station, looked completely lost. He was fumbling with his notes, looking from me to Sharon to Richard. "He killed my son," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden lull as Dale's confession ended. They both did, for $800,000. The dam of social politeness broke. Shouts of "murderer" and "monster" were thrown at the stage. Sharon covered her ears, shaking her head, tears of rage, not sorrow, streaming down her face. Richard had made it to the edge of the stage, trying to climb up, still shouting about lies and conspiracies. That's when the main ballroom doors burst open. They didn't swing open gently. They were thrown open, hitting the walls with a deafening crash. Two uniformed police officers stood in the doorway, their expressions grim. Behind them, more officers were flooding into the lobby. The soft music of the country club was replaced by the sharp, urgent crackle of police radios. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. A symphony of justice arriving late but not too late. The flashing red and blue lights painted the panicked faces of the wealthy guests in stark, terrifying colors. One of the officers pointed directly at Richard. "Richard, stay where you are," his voice boomed, cutting through the chaos. Richard froze, one foot on the stage, his tailored suit suddenly looking like a prisoner's uniform. Sharon let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. Her perfect world, built on a foundation of blood, money, and lies, was collapsing around her in real time. The charity event for her son had become the scene of her downfall. The hammer had fallen, and this was only the beginning. The chaos was a painting of rich people panicking. Their perfect evening of champagne and charity had been shattered. Richard, seeing the officers, tried to melt back into the crowd, but it was like trying to hide in a field of pointing fingers. Everyone was looking at him. His face, usually so smooth and confident, was a mess of sweat and fear. "Don't move!" the second officer shouted, his hand resting on his sidearm. Sharon just stood on the stage, paralyzed. The microphone she had been clutching fell from her hand and hit the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the silent room. Her eyes darted between the police at the door and me, standing there with the projector. In her eyes, I saw it all. The realization that the game was over, that every lie had finally caught up with her. The officers moved with purpose, parting the sea of expensive dresses and tuxedos. One went for Richard, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back with a practiced efficiency that made Richard yelp in pain. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a lock turning on a cage that had been built for my son. The other officer climbed onto the stage toward Sharon. She didn't resist. She just started sobbing, a pathetic, theatrical sound that nobody was buying anymore. "I didn't do anything," she whimpered as he cuffed her wrists in front of her. "It was all him. He made me do it." She pointed a cuffed hand at Richard, who was being dragged toward the door. He turned his head, his face purple with rage. "You liar. It was your idea. You wanted the money," he screamed back. The guests watched, their phones out, recording every second. The flashes from their cameras were relentless, like a strobe light at a horror show. I saw Walter, the MX, just shaking his head, his face pale. Kenneth and Martin, Richard's partners, didn't even look look at him as he was pushed past them. They simply turned their backs, a final, brutal confirmation of his complete ruin. The charity event for Ethan's memory had become a live-streamed spectacle of his murderer's downfall. The days that followed were a blur of headlines and news reports. The country club killers, one paper called them. Another ran a picture of Sharon in her evening gown, crying in handcuffs with the headline, "Grieving Mother's Deadly Secret." Their entire world collapsed. The country club membership was revoked. Friends stopped answering their calls. The financial firm Richard built with Kenneth and Martin immediately fired him and issued a public statement condemning his actions. Every bridge they had built with my son's blood money was burned to the ground. Dale's full confession, coupled with the financial records I had sent to the police and Richard's partners, made the case airtight. The trial was short. Dale testified against them in exchange for a reduced sentence for his part in it. Watching Sharon and Richard in court was like watching two strangers. Stripped of their designer clothes and smug smiles, they were just small, greedy people. The jury found them guilty on all counts: murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud. They were each sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 30 years. About a year later, I got a letter. It was from Sharon. She wanted me to visit her. I didn't know why I went. Maybe I needed to see it for myself to close the final chapter. The prison visiting room was a gray, lifeless place that smelled of disinfectant and regret. When she walked in, wearing a faded orange jumpsuit, I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was gray at the roots. Her face was thin and tired, and the fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull emptiness. We sat across from each other at a small metal table. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I don't know," I answered honestly. She looked down at her hands, which were chapped and raw. "I think about him every day," she said. "I really do. I see his face when I close my eyes." For a moment I saw a flicker of something real, a tiny spark of the mother she once was. The money, it wasn't worth it. None of it was. I just looked at her. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel pity. I felt nothing. She was a ghost, a memory of a person I used to love. "You didn't just kill Ethan," I said, my voice steady. "You killed everything we ever were. You took the memory of our son, and you tried to burn it for cash." A single tear rolled down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I stood up. "Goodbye, Sharon." I walked out of that prison and didn't look back. The sun was bright outside. I got in my car and drove away, leaving her and Richard to rot in the world they had made for themselves. The pain would never fully go away, but for the first time since Ethan's death, I felt like I could breathe again. The score was settled. My son could finally rest in peace. From a grieving husband to a jail cell for Sharon and Richard. I walked out of prison, leaving them to their fate, finally able to breathe. What did you think of my justice? Subscribe for more intense stories like this.